Hey everybody, what's up? It's Booksy. Today is Tuesday, October 31st. It's Halloween, and I'm going to talk about AMC stock today. I have a couple things I want to run through on AMC, starting with the daily here. Kind of a big picture analysis on what I perceive as kind of the main push up here, and then what I think will be like an M cross. We've been talking about a pullback, and the last couple of videos I talked about, I think it come back down to like maybe 960, and then it kept running. So I was saying earlier in the stream, I think you could bring that number up to 980. The level that is in question is really these tops from the previous range. If you look at October 25th, and then back a little bit further, near the 19th, those are kind of the areas that I don't feel like we've done a lot of liquidity exploration on. But all that being said, we are going back through a region that we've technically gone through before. The last time we passed through 980 on October 10th and 11th, we did pull back to 980, and we had an advance from that point forward. So we built a foundation off of that 980 level. At this particular point in time, it just sort of depends on your outlook, whether you think that's going to happen or not. A lot of times, AMC, once it takes off and you start getting those big green days, it can take quite a while to advance and get to wherever it's going. We know already that 1117 will be a stopping point because of the gap fill, and it's probably going to be an area that we see a little bit of hesitation before we move forward. If nothing else, you should see an SOS appear, which would be like a small range that retests that top and then continues up probably then to 1350. No one is really, at least from my point of view, no one's really concerned about extreme downside, except for maybe a few folks who are following certain fractals or who are considering like the possibility of this being like a Cattier breakdown that then distributes. We still have about a week or so till earnings, and we've got time to make some pretty big moves, whether that's up or down or just kind of sideways. The longer that this goes on, and it just sort of occurred to me today, the more I started to think about how this seemed really familiar to me. Felt a little bit like deja vu, like we've just done something like this. And it's not because of the breakout, it's because of the way that the top is kind of developing here. And I'll get into that in a minute, but I wanted to show that if we were to have a pullback to that 981 level, I think there's kind of this fear that it wouldn't work out, like it would be bad or something. But that's not actually true at all. If you look at a 50% retracement, that's really healthy. And the previous zone that we were in actually was a 50% retracement. So we moved up, and then we came back about 50% and rested right above it and then moved again. So the idea of having another possible 50% retracement after an advance here is not at all unusual. In fact, if you look at where that is, maybe 1085 could be a top, something like that. I know you're thinking, well, there's a gap there, so wouldn't we just fill the gap? We didn't do that here either. It kind of teased out the longs who were looking for this to kind of continue on and go through the gap fill, and it didn't do it. And that's where I started thinking, like, man, I really feel like I've seen this before, because someone on stream today said, hey, we've got this cup and handle, and now they're saying, well, maybe there would be another cup and handle. And we were thinking out loud about it and just kind of talking about it on the stream and exploring that. It doesn't seem unreasonable to me. A lot of the times you get these little tiny cup and handles before breakouts, we just don't notice them, because if the schematic is really small, you may not even see it. It might be this like really mild kind of move to the downside before you move back up. And a lot of times it's almost imperceptible when you're looking at it from the higher perspective. And sure enough, if you go back and you look at this original run up over here, I say original, but the one that we started with, we do have that kind of vibe. You get that push up on the advance towards the SOS, you get that nice little cup, and then you pull back to the upside. And it does that repeatedly on the way up. So it's not unusual at all to think that that could be part of the iteration. What's weird, and maybe what's a little bit odd to me, is this particular top structure. It's a four top, right? And you count it 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it drops. The same thing applied over here when it did the 1, 2, 3, 4, and then dropped. In both cases, you have this kind of last ditch push up. They both have this very parabolic move, right? That kind of goes and accelerates towards the top before that big drop. And you have a very similar action right here. And you can't see it because it's pretty small, but we're experiencing something that looks fairly similar right now. And the more I started looking at it, the more I started thinking, this is a very real possibility. One thing I hadn't really considered about earnings was this possibility that we just go mostly sideways. We basically end up right where we are right now into earnings. And it could totally happen on the basis of like kind of a repetition here that doesn't actually breach new highs. Now, if this were to go above 1117, you run a greater risk of this being what we would call a UT, which is an upthrust. It comes too high, and then it starts selling off, and ultimately it could be at a great risk of that, especially if it then comes beneath, going into earnings, for example, maybe it comes beneath this marker. Then you have a lot more risk involved in that trade because it could easily become very distributive very fast. But ideally, if it doesn't go higher, I know you guys are thinking, well, why can't it just go straight up? Well, it can, and that's what I'm trying to say. Like, technically, it's already sort of broken out here in some ways. When you look at this outermost creek at this time, it's exited. It hasn't come back and checked it, so that's a bit problematic. But yeah, it's exited. But the reason I'm going through this particular scenario is because it just occurred to me today that what we're experiencing, a lot of this just looks like a repeat of what we just did. I mean, if you look at, for example, on like 1 hour right now, and you look at this motion right here, it's pretty much the same. And you'll notice that even though in both cases, we start from about 50 RSI, because we had adequate pullbacks, and this is kind of like maybe an advocation for like, hey, we want to pull back, right? Because every time it pulled back, it came back to being not overbought, right? And then it makes an advance again. We haven't gotten any of those. So at least thus far, it's been pretty much just a straight shot up until about the end of the day today. And we'll get to that with no pullback at all. And so on the 1 hour, it's still overbought. But it does have a very similar vibe to what we just did. Not only that, but there's some pretty key important markers here as well that we're going to look at. Before I do that, I want to talk about this comparison that I'm making. There are some folks that may be looking at this comparison and saying, well, this looks a lot like what we're experiencing right now. Maybe it's just doing the same thing. It could be, but the big difference is that the way in which this range right here particularly formed is it had this upthrust and then a UTAD at the very end. It didn't ultimately have that adequate. It has a creek cross, right? And it holds. But if you look at the reverse, it actually has this kind of quasi breakdown. It seems okay. There's parts of it that, again, kind of look like you're all right. But then if you look at where it actually was, it was really just a fake out move with the volume the way that it was. And ultimately, like this is probably the only major tell that we have was that UT right here, that upthrust that went higher than it should have, and that presents it as a possible distribution instead of like a reaccumulation. Reaccumulations look a lot like distributions. They just do. But I would argue that, look, it is similar. There are similarities in terms of like how this RSI seems to be setting up. There's obviously differences in volume. I don't need to get into that. But I will say this, is that predominantly, like I'm kind of looking at it more like this right now, though, because you'll note that on that immediate push-up, okay, it went to fill a gap here, and then it comes back down, and it jumps over, and it makes a higher low, and then has a continuation afterwards. And in particular, this is kind of like the main cross that happens at the very end. Before that point, you have another one that's a bit lower, right? And you can see how they're jumping over. And then on the whole, you've got this trending down. There is no upthrust motion per se. It doesn't ever exceed the high. And then ultimately this bottom, as we see, it produces higher lows, right? Whereas here you can see it went too high, like really high, really fast on that cross, and then retreats, and ultimately that generates this kind of hooking action with just a small bull trap at the very end. So when I look at this, part of me thinks that we really just got to that creek. If you think about this downtrend, there's two major kind of elements here. One is like this major downtrend, which is the one that we were all kind of staring at anyways for a while. And that's this guy, I think. And when you get to this, obviously we've jumped over that. Like the most extreme part of that, right, was down here. If you look at the outermost points, we've jumped over that. You know, we're kind of done, right? There's not really much else to say. I think this one probably the strongest one. If you look at the bottom, you can see it's really strong. And then of course it goes from here all the way over to the top. So I would say like that's pretty much finished at this point. But then if you look at like the more mild creeks, if you want to call them that, like this guy right here, we just approached it. So this concept that we might just take off, I agree, like it's totally possible if we get over these markers here, but I also kind of feel like we could be experiencing something like this, where we're just sort of laying up underneath these creek bodies, and as long as we're narrowing, that could be really healthy. You can see the end result for this was that huge move to the upside, and I don't think it would be any different as long as it doesn't make a higher high here. If this comes above, then you have a strong risk of distribution, right? If it comes above and comes back down, okay? So I'm advocating a little bit for maybe like a top around 1080 that then turns back around. You guys are like, not 1080 again. That turns back around and comes back to the downside. Now, I'm 12 minutes into this video. You probably are like, I don't get this. Why are you even talking about this? It doesn't have me convinced. Sure, like I could see this being a pullback right here for liquidity, and then maybe that's kind of like a way to get like a little LPS going that then pushes up after earnings. Fine. You got me there. There's these parallels. Okay, we're pushing over, but why not just continue up? Well, here you have the argument that we did pull back, and we actually did a really healthy pullback and then continued, and here we have not. So you would expect something like that. But that's not really why I'm making the argument, if you want to call it that. Is actually because of, again, this kind of deja vu that I'm having in this particular setup. So during this move today, this bowl shape just has a lot of that UT feel to it, where you have an upthrust, then you have a secondary upthrust that might even extend tomorrow pretty high, but does it on potentially weaker volume. And ultimately it's kind of like it could be presented as sort of like a last gasp. The main difference that you can see in these particular moves is like these are very accumulative, you know. You're getting these kind of wide bounces, and they're, again, up until a point, right, they start looking pretty good, and then you start getting this kind of like parabolic move to the upside here, okay? But it just sort of occurred to me again that like this looks really similar. We've been talking about that for weeks now. The reaccumulation as we see it looks really similar, but there's a kind of a key difference, and that's just the way this is jumping over the current creeks. But I started looking at the other factors in this, and I was like, well, I remember there being kind of this trend that broke sideways during that U shape, and I went and I was looking at this one, and I was like, oh, you know, it kind of looks like it's doing the same thing right now. Like it's going across it, broke out sideways from the uptrend, and it looks like it's ready to have that kind of extension move at this present time. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, you know, let me check some other stuff. And I looked at the tops, and I saw that, and I remembered anyways, whether I saw it or not. I kind of remembered that during this time period, if you had gone back, and it's a little too high, but if you'd gone back and you had traced this particular M cross, which would have been like kind of like the middle of it before the breakout, this gives you like a really clean measurement tool for this S curve here as it came up. And I remembered that it hit that marker multiple times, 1, 2 times, and it ends up distributing right below it as well. Like we kind of gap down right around it and then drop. So I was like, well, if they're similar, you might see something, again, pretty close to the same thing, in this particular time frame. So the best way for me to gauge that would be to look at potentially like, the bottoms down here. I think this is the similar area, right? I don't think it's necessarily a big controversy to even suggest that. So I feel like at this particular venture, when you're looking at that kind of middle structure and you're thinking about, well, why were you so sure it would come back there? It was mostly because I didn't think that was the adequate hit. I thought we were going to extend beyond it and come back down around that kind of center structure. We really didn't do that. We hadn't had that pullback. But now looking at it, it's kind of like, oh, well, it actually looks very similar to what we experienced over here. And it looks like just a smaller version of the bigger picture, almost one-to-one in that regard. Albeit we didn't get a last spring here, we got an LPS. So some mild differences for sure. I went in and I checked something else, which we'll just call it ranges, or we'll call it like I'd rather call it like channels or something. And I'll show you what I mean when I pull this up. Now this is kind of ugly, but I started looking at Head and Shoulders, not Head and Shoulders. I started looking at, this is kind of a messy video, I know, but bear with me, okay, if you can. So this is the same markers I just drew, but they're in yellow. So then what I did is I looked at that trend right here, and I made a large channel. So here's the large channel, dragging it around the screen, and I dragged it from the bottom to the top, specifically to this top. I didn't use this one, I guess I could have, but specifically to this top. And I noticed that when you do that, and you have that subdivision, when you see it, suddenly it's like, oh, well, in a manner of speaking, you can start seeing it as it forms out here. I was like, well, that's the halfway point right here, correct? And you can see that both of these kind of form around that halfway point. But I started looking at, again, the overall picture, and I was like, well, it comes up, and this is a bit smaller looking to me. It's like more narrow. So I decided I would divide that one in half again. And lo and behold, this retracement actually comes right back down to that half of a half. And it is meeting this particular trend as well, which is heavily met throughout. And then you look at where the accumulation finally finishes, and it's in this lower pocket. And in both cases, you get to the edge and then you take off. I took that and divided it again into halves, and you can see that there it is right here. And again, sure enough, that ends up playing like a pretty important role in terms of support. Why do all that? Well, the main reason is because when we were on stream today, I noticed that this bars pattern, if you want to call it that, this particular LPS, if it is a cup and handle, I already talked about how this went like a 50% down. It turns out this is about 50% the length as well. So if you take the length of the cup here, and I've got it drawn to this inner portion, which maybe we'll get to in a minute, but if you take the length here, it's about 700. And then this one ends up being about 350. So it's about half. And then if you take another half of that, and you look at that, it should be around 175. Not surprisingly, this lands you on earnings day. So if you continue to divide these into halves, you find that that actually goes to earnings day. So what I did and what I decided to do was, well, let me see what happens, right, if you try to duplicate this again, but smaller. Because we already know that this is, I'm on the 15 minute, it looks like it's running up still, even though the RSI is coming down. But on the 1 hour, this is oversold already, right? It's doing that kind of thing where, to me, it looks like it's kind of made that push, and it might have like this kind of last minute extension here and then pull back again. So one, we've got the gap that starts both of these after that like four top creature at the top. Two, we've got the same kind of M cross to that build up. Three, they're both apparently abiding by very similar rules. And again, I wasn't overly surprised to find that this guy, when you use the extension, the same extensions that you use on the original one, doesn't actually get to the top. It only gets to potentially about the 50% marker. on the main channel. So I was like, okay, so what? That doesn't mean that it's going to happen. It doesn't. But what I decided to do was I might as well test it and see what it would look like. So what I did is I did like a 1-to-1. So we've got a 50% reduction in time. We've got a 50% reduction in vertical height. So it's a 50% pullback. So it's an adequate cup and handle structure for that reason. It would go about 50% down, which again takes you to that 980 region. Okay. And it depends on how high it goes. If in this particular case, it extended up beyond where you would expect. So if it goes up to 1117, it's obviously going to be a little different than the way I drew it. But nonetheless, this is still that pocket region, and this is the region that we wanted to see us come back to anyways. When you take that same structure and you model it, but on the smaller time frame, so again, if you take, for example, a bars pattern here and you look at how this navigated across the 50% line in the larger channel, and then how it gravitates towards the next 50%, and then the next 50%, and then down, it's a pretty standard looking operation here. You can kind of see it without trying too hard. If you just kind of stare at those 50% markers, okay? I know it's not perfect on this one, but if you were to talk about this stair stepping, you might say it looks kind of like that. And when you look at the next one, it's essentially like the same thing. So I went to, and you look at the previous one, it's essentially the same thing. So I went and mapped it, and this is what I came up with. Now, what's fascinating to me about this is that I went ahead and I looked at where that intersection was, and you'll notice that the intersection here, where these kind of triangulate to, drawn from that top, ends up being pretty much where the creek finishes and ultimately takes off. So I'm going to keep that on the chart, but I want you to know also that if you take this and you drag it up to the tippy top here, this does look like an adequate creek check to backtest that creek. There's no guarantees that this doesn't, iterate smaller and smaller again, and we wouldn't even necessarily notice it. But as it stands, it looks like a really solid cup and handle pattern. I did the measurements. This is a 410. This is a $1.75. This would be about 70 cents. And I did the measurements on the breakouts, and the breakouts take you to basically all the way back up to about, I want to say it was like here, 1522 on each of those breakouts. Now you might be saying, well, what? Doesn't look as far, but this is a logarithmic chart. And if you do it with logarithmic measurements, it really goes to something more like 17 or 18, which could be this full gap fill up here. I'm going to do just with price targets, like pricing, not logarithmic percentage targets. Okay? Because percentage targets are much larger. If you take a percentage here and you look at that and you say, oh, it's going up 58%, well, 58% extension here is pretty high. It's way up here. Right? But if you do the dollar value, it's not nearly that severe. This is like about, again, I said about 410 to the top, and then you take that same measurement and measure it up again, and it only goes up to that 1522 level, okay? So what's interesting here is that you've got a strong chance based on P&F, which is point and figure, that this thing could get to 13. If you do this, it adds more to it without breaking anything down. And as long as you don't come too high, you actually have a stronger chance of that bigger run happening. And then you've got like a 1, 2, 3 stored up cup and handle breakout, because you've got one here, and then potentially one here, though we don't know exactly what that might look like. One could imagine that it would essentially just be a really small cup and handle that doesn't ultimately come all the way back down here, right? That would be pretty wild. It could, I suppose, but a 50% retrace with continuation at the end in that minor area, and this gives you like a massive, potentially massive breakout. So why would I even think that this is likely? Well, I know that earnings often presents itself as this opportunity to see us run up into earnings. I think a lot of folks, including myself, were expecting this run up to be today, maybe tomorrow and the next day. But it does seem like something a long operator would do to just kind of keep it slow and methodical and really trap as many calls as they can in this. It also allows for a potential reversal to happen near the end. So for example, if this ends up being an upthrust, which I hope it doesn't, but if it ends up being an upthrust, more than likely you would end up having like an upthrust after distribution over here. Does that make sense? And this is pretty typical of that cat ear structure, where the first one would be pointed and then you have that low area, and then the second would be this big flat chopped off area. And it presents itself really well with the algorithmic components that we usually see, no matter if it goes up or down. So that's one reason why I think it could do that. The second, of course, is that mathematically right now it just looks really clean. That doesn't mean it will happen. It just means that, hey, the way it's setting up seems to be setting up to have that pullback be 50%, potentially just have a repeat of what we just went through. Maybe it's faster, but essentially that puts us at earnings, which is a pretty strong coincidence. The other thing is that if you continue to have this lower, you could really build up, again, more ammunition for a bigger move to the upside. And including this over here, once you get up there, I think you have a strong potential to probably make that gap fill happen all the way up to 20, if that were the case. I don't know for a fact that this is going to happen. I think a lot of the times when we look at stuff like this and we're talking about retracements, you get kind of the stinky eye, right? But the vibe here is really similar to the vibe that we had over here, like really similar top forming. It seems like it's doing that same kind of thing, but everything's like smaller and more compressed. I'm seeing it especially on, like certain time frames, like that 1 hour, for example. It's already, overbought. That doesn't mean it can't have more time above, but it does seem to have that. I did note that on the 4 hour, it's divergent right now. So if it were to approach 17, it would be doing so with a more cooled off RSI. Now, potentially that means that you could have more upside, but a lot of times that's just divergence, right? It's like you're getting that second up thrust, it goes to the same place, but the RSI is lower. That's just the divergent RSI, in which case it could be more of like a distributive action, especially if it goes higher with a lower RSI on the top. Does that make sense? As a top goes. It could always correct that by finding support, by like chilling it out and just kind of moving past it. So RSI is not the end all be all, but it often indicates a change in direction before you get there. So if you're seeing the RSI start coming back down over time, maybe repeated hits here on the same level, or even worse, could be a little higher, right? Higher than that and then higher than that, and these are coming down. That could be a bad sign of a more major turn that's about to happen to the downside. So I don't want to be a naysayer. I still think the volume here looks pretty good. There's not very much selling going on. It definitely looks like buying. It looks like it could be the start of a bigger move that's maybe ramping up here. And the thing is if none of this happens, and I'm approaching that 30-minute mark on the video, I know it's long, but I hope you're getting something out of it. And I'm not going to be, probably not going to be streaming much at all, or on anything, Discord or stream or anything tomorrow. But I think the idea here makes sense to me. Whether or not it happens, I don't know. I think you're going to need to watch key levels, and you're going to have to sort of look at these particular tops, especially here. I think tomorrow morning, the first stop, if it does break to the upside, would probably be pretty high. It'd be like 1090 or something like that. And I don't think that's unreasonable to sort of expect it to kind of push up hard and then come down. So if you do get that kind of gap up or something like that, really pay attention to that level, and then specifically look at 1057. That's the center point of this little lower range here. As this range was going, I felt like it was distributive. It could be a reaccumulation. It started hopping creeks, making higher lows, and it didn't really slow down end of day. I thought initially, because it came down below that preliminary support over here, that it looked a bit bearish to me, and then it had that early up thrust, but it did make a lower low relative to itself, but it didn't make a lower low relative to that early push, and then it just started making higher lows. So it's kind of tricky, right? And I know there's other things here at play, but to me, like this was probably like a stopping point, and then I was expecting there to be another push, and we did get it, but I'm kind of flip-flopping on this. So what I'm thinking though is that the best thing to do would be to look at this trend right here. We've already left. I mean, frankly, we've already broken down out of that uptrend, so there's not really much to say about that. The uptrend's gone. At least in terms of like the actual, hard and fast side. That doesn't mean you can't come up into it or find support again on it, whatever. But that trend to me is finished. So I'm kind of looking at this like, all right, it already broke sideways. You're getting this kind of reactive move. I was watching it. The middle of the range happened. It bounced off that 1057. So early day tomorrow, I'd be looking at roughly 1090 to see if it finds support. If it were to continue upward, yeah, you've got that possibility. It's just going to go for it all the way up to 1117. I would favor it a lot better. I'd feel a lot more comfortable if we didn't go to 1117 right now. I know it sounds weird. And if we do go there, we need to find support above it. It needs to be like an SOS. So I don't want to go up above it, test it, and then retreat. That just puts us in a bad kind of dicey situation where we may end up with a distribution on our hands. So in my opinion, best case scenario is that we do get a little early pump, but then it starts distributing down. At which point, if it breaks 1057, I think you're likely going to then break that 1048, probably head down to 1032 and that 1026 level down below. I believe that's only going to be about half the distance we'll travel, but I think that would be an adequate first stop, maybe going into sort of an downward S-curve action into Thursday. And then, Thursday, Friday, I think you might have a bit of a pump and dump on our hands and end the week somewhere around, $10 or something like that. Again, no guarantees here because this hasn't happened, right? There isn't been a strong breakdown yet. We just kind of have this particular motion that just really reminds me of the last one, and it's approaching a similar level, and the setup's really similar. Maybe it won't be the same, right? I don't know. All I'm saying is right now it looks very suspicious to me. It just reminds me of the same things, and I'm very curious to see what happens when it gets to this 1090 area, which is about that halfway point on those channels. And then I'm going to really watch carefully for that pullback and see if it does a 50% retrace like it did last time. The good news is if it does that, we might have basically a roadmap, which would be really awesome, that you could trade because it essentially do the same thing we've already seen, but just compressed. And that makes it pretty easy to estimate what may happen. It won't be exactly the same. It can be similar, So all of that being said, to me, that looks like a really strong possibility going into an earnings. I can't guarantee anything right now. Here's that four top I was talking about. It's just kind of presenting itself that same way. And there's even this kind of hooking action right here that's happening right now at the end. So it just sort of, to me anyways, it feels very similar to what we experienced here, but it's just on a really small scale. And we didn't really ever get that bigger retrace back down. So seems likely to me that happens, okay? I will not be able to do videos or anything until tomorrow late in the afternoon. So if something changes, I'm not going to sit there and change everything. It's just going to be what it is. Hopefully this made sense to you as I explained it. It's essentially like a series of cup and handle iterations, and that may not happen again, but it just seems like it might. It's got that same vibe going into the top. So I think it's possible, right? Now, if it doesn't happen, and again, I'm just going to, to recap, because I mentioned it a couple times, but I want to be really clear. If you can get over 1117 and come back down and eventually land back on the top, you could just go. And at this point, we're all talking about 13 and all that jazz. I think you definitely could get there. I don't know if it'll get there in one jump, but you'll probably get there. You know what I mean? It's right up here. So could it get to that place where it gap fills by earnings? Oh yeah. I mean, you can see it right there. There's earnings. There's the top of the channel. It's basically right where the gap is. I got that blue thing marked off. It might be slightly below that. But yeah, I mean, it totally could get there before. But all you'd be really watching for is to see if it can push above here and then find support on it. And that's an adequate SOS. So the alternative to this kind of crazy iterative move here right now could be just a breakout. The only situation that's obviously more or less bad, I just say, is if you come up really high and then you come way down low. In which case, we might have a problem on our hands, right? Because it could end up being a very distributive style top. If that were to happen, the analysis is going to change quite a bit. So all that being said, I hope you guys have a great, happy Halloween, and we'll talk to you later.